something that's chilling in what I understand to be your vision, because I interpret you as saying we have the wrong wants. We're not the people we should be, that the subjects are endogenous. They are partly produced by the system. And what they want now, air conditioning, 4-lane highways, jet planes that are intercontinental, keeping my temperature in the wintertime, an automobile. They want the wrong things. I mean, because there are how many billions of us? 7 billion of us or something like that. And you're saying the planet won't sustain us all having the wrong thing, all wanting the wrong things. But then that puts you in the business of making me want something else.
I think we need to have that conversation.
Trade, markets, profit, corporations, property. These are the institutional preconditions. The state capitalism of China is a cousin of the liberal capitalism of North America. They do have a family resemblance. There's not any doubt about that. Although a lot matters on the details, especially if you have a dissenting point of view and you want to live your life.
Sort of fancy Disney adult vision of America that was presented by Barack Obama has been repudiated significantly twice. I would say 3 times, not only by Trump's first victory, but also by the desiccated corpse of Joe Biden becoming president and then Trump becoming president again. I mean, this is a repudiation of the entire neoliberal, technocratic, institutionalist vision of Obama. And I think that's really the most important story of today, because liberalism doesn't have anything to offer.
Everybody out there, you have tuned into The Glenn Show. Glenn Loury here. I teach at Brown University. I'm the Merton Stoltz Professor of the Social Sciences there. And I'm John Paulson Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute and host of The Glenn Show. And I'm joined this week by Daniel Bessner, who is Professor of International Studies at the Henry Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington, and a friend of mine. He's a friend of The Glenn Show, been on many times to talk. He's a lefty. We're going to forgive him that, but he's one of the smartest people I know, actually. People get mad at me for saying that, Daddy, because you have your enemies out there. They're going to say, no, he hasn't set up his butt. He's a blaming idiot, blah, blah, blah. But no, I think he's a pretty smart guy. And last time I saw you, I think, was in the green room or something at Bill Maher's studio for the TV show, because we did the show together. So you see. And I should mention my book, Late Admissions, Confessions of a Black Conservative, published by Norton in May of 2024 and available at your booksellers, was abetted in its development by conversations I had with Daniel, in which he kind of interviewed me about my own life, and I used those transcripts to help get my head around the book. So, Danny, welcome back to The Glenn Show. Sorry for that long introduction, man, but you deserve it.
I really appreciate it. And I always love talking to you, Glenn. It's a genuine honor, really, one of the highlights of my intellectual career, to have developed a relationship with you in a real way. And I think I always listen to your podcast, and I think you're one of the most important intellectuals today. It didn't, just to sort of gas you up a little bit, for that article that was written for the Chronicle of Higher Education, my quote didn't get in, but I think they kind of asked me about your shifts from left to right. And one of the things we'll probably talk a little bit about this conversation, I don't think actually your intellectual trajectory really reflects that. You're much more of an American character. You can't be really sort of fit in to these binaries that I would argue don't really make sense in the American context and never really did. We could talk about that a little bit more, but you're like a classic, almost 19th century sort of Emersonian, thinking through different things. And so it's a real honor to talk to you. And everyone who disagrees with me is just wrong.
Danny is an intellectual historian. If you didn't get his drift, he's got the big picture thing, and I don't mind being fitted into it. Although you embarrass me. But I mean, I do have this thing about being left, being right, being left, being right. And am I going like this, or is there a different way of thinking about a different kind of set of axes to analyze the thing with?
Well, I think this is actually where it's useful to adopt a historical perspective. And just to go off on a little bit of a thing here, it's really the left-right political spectrum is only adopted in this country in the 1940s. Basically, your life is concomitant with it. Before that, we didn't really have a left-right spectrum. You have the populists, you have the Whigs, you have the Republicans, you have the Democrats. They're reflecting different things that are very separate from the effectively European left-right political spectrum. But the reason, which is interesting, and I think this leads to what we're going to talk about today, this crisis of liberalism, is that the left-right political spectrum is really only adopted in the 1940s by essentially the New Deal liberals, who are then becoming more Cold War liberals or national security liberals over the course of the 1940s. And essentially what they did was that they defined themselves as the moderate center, with communism on the left and fascism on the right. So everything is sort of moving around this pole of a New Deal liberalism over the last 70 or so years. And so I think what's happening now, and like you see it a lot actually in the podcast sphere, which is that people are returning to almost a pre-World War II American understanding of politics, of matrix, where left and right don't really make sense because, of course, right, what it actually refers to is monarchism for the most part, and left refers to communism. But it's only in the United States that right began to refer to fascism because liberals, as you saw in the piece I sent you, needed to define themselves as the moderate and rational center. So it makes sense that you're going back and forth between left and right because those categories don't really work in this country, and they never really did.
Now, we are speaking, today is November 9th. The election was November 5th, the election that everybody knows
Who won?
Trump triumphed in across the board. We don't have to go into the details unless it's necessary to explicate your point of view, Danny. And I'm very interested in how you read the repudiation of the Democratic Party, the endorsement of Donald Trump, notwithstanding his demonization and notwithstanding his objectively problematic character traits, policy suggestions, and so on. What's going on in the country, do you think, and what goes forward? I just read a piece by Francis Fukuyama. I won't try to recount it, but I know I know it's not your view. It's not your view. So, I mean, anyway.
I actually really very much respect Fukuyama. I wrote a big piece on him for The Nation. Where I basically read his entire, I really focused on that first decade of his career. His first publication is, I believe, in 79, The End of History. The essay with the question mark removed when it became a book, is in 1989. And I think Fukuyama, what you're referring to is essentially said that he is wrong, that the end of history is over. But I actually think Fukuyama is wrong in saying that his earlier instantiation is wrong. What has happened is that the utopian, small u, because it was never that much of a utopia, the utopian promise of post-Cold War liberalism hasn't come to be, right? I hate when academics say right because it's basically cutting off conversation. But here, this is what I would say. That if you're looking at what people are saying in the late 80s and 90s, basically the decade of my youth, they're saying that capitalism won and that you're going to be able to construct some form of modern utopia, that there'll be more equality, there'll be more equity, there'll be less violence in the world. And what has, I think, empirically been shown to be the case is that hasn't come to be. So you have
notwithstanding Steven Pinker and company.
I just think they're wrong, and I think they're. So we once had a conversation about social science and its utility and lack thereof. I think the type of social scientific claims that they are trying to make don't just hold up to scrutiny, that there's actually a gap between the evidence that they provide and what they're attempting to show. So I would just bracket that for a second. I think this sort of like thing about life is there are fewer deaths and there's less disease. That is of course true, but then you have to define what is meant by progress. This is not an objective thing. There's subjective fact that the sort of good things that Pinker describes, which are absolutely true, have also come along with social alienation, et cetera, et cetera. And so why do you get that? Is that just a dialectic of enlightenment? But whatever you would say about it is that liberalism certainly did not achieve the high hopes that were set for it after the end of the Cold War. However, what has also happened is that there have been no ideological challengers of liberalism to arise, basically. There's no communism. There's no fascism. Liberalism is the only ideology available.
The populism that you see upcropping around the world is not a response?
I don't really think so. I think that's more of a reaction to the failure of liberalism as opposed to its own positive program. You see it, for example, in the United States, where essentially the positive message is to reindustrialize the United States, which to me is an incredibly atavistic, backward-looking program. I was listening to Adam Tooze the other day, and something like only 8 or 9% of the American economy consists of manufacturing. It's a total service economy.
Yeah.
So that is just, to me, a literal reaction, a reactionary approach to the failure of liberalism, not an actually positive forward-thinking vision. The best positive forward-thinking vision you got was from Bernie Sanders, which was really just a return to New Deal liberalism, an earlier instantiation of pre-World War II liberalism. So there's been no genuine ideological challengers. And I think that explains why a lot of us feel insane, because the failures of liberalism, I think to me, were very obvious for a long time. The rise of inequality, the failure to deal with climate, the repeated and endless wars that liberalism and liberal empires have pursued, but there's been no challenge to it. In fact, not only that, the economic system that liberalism has supported, I would say capitalism has, in my opinion, at least some people disagree, been effectively embraced by the entire world, whether it's the state capitalism of China, the kleptocratic capitalism of Russia, or the liberal democratic capitalism of the United States. Capitalism has effectively won. There's no real way of thinking of other ways to organize the economy. So you have this moment
Well, that's a
where
good thing, isn't it?
I mean, look at the results. Would you say? What do you think? Do you think it's a good thing?
Well, yeah, I think it's a good thing. On the whole, I think the rise of the economies in East Asia and South Asia and the drawing of hundreds of millions of people out of villages and into cities, and the increasing the kind of objective standard of living measures that you talk about is a good thing compared to mass starvation and penury and uneducated women and things of this kind.
I mean, it would be difficult to agree, to disagree. Sorry, it would be difficult to disagree. I agree with you that one could say that's a good thing.
No, and I think trade, markets, profit, corporations, property, these are the institutional preconditions. I am inclined to agree, and I'm not an expert here, that the state capitalism of China is a cousin of the liberal capitalism of North America. They do have a family resemblance. There's not any doubt about that. Although a lot matters on the details, especially if you have a dissenting point of view and you want to live your life. But, yeah.
So then I would say there are two problems as I see it. One is the inability to deal with climate, because there is a connection between the consumption promoted by capitalism and really the fact that became the inherent American identity, and in parts of China has become that as well, and the fact that that's clearly generating climate problems, right? So there's an issue there that all of the countries have proved incapable of dealing with. But then there's an issue that China is actually coming up against now, and the United States has been coming up against for the last 20, 30 years, is that once you get that rapid urbanization, once you get that rapid development, where do you go from there? Because there's basically, I mean, I'm curious what you think about it. What do you think about the falling rate of profit theory? That over time, that there's a falling rate of profit and capital has fewer and fewer places to go. So it's going to distort more and more industries. I think that's happening. So, for example, I don't know, I think I sent it to you, Glenn, but I'm not sure if you read it. I wrote a big piece for Harper's on the entertainment industry, which has effectively...
I did read it, Danny. If you sent it to me, I apologize.
No worries. But basically the point was that the dual processes of monopolization / conglomeration, which are connected, and financialization has effectively transformed the entertainment industry into a gig economy, basically making it not a good, stable thing. And I think this is happening throughout the entire world. So whereas deindustrialization... Well,
what about new stuff? I mean, tech and all of that, you know.
I mean, it's all labor saving, right? So like the fetishization of tech, I think, has basically ignored.
I mean, in terms of the falling rate of profit, I mean, yeah, if I'm staying in the same lane and I'm trying to get more and more intensively into that lane, I'm going to encounter certain limitations, diminishing returns, and things of this kind. It's going to get crowded and it's going to be less remunerative, but opening up a new lane, finding another or a different direction. People didn't have computers in their pockets 30 years ago. They have them now. And all that comes with that. And you said mostly service. Well, service potential for innovation, development, and whatnot, you might say, is much more open than, because we're just finding different ways of causing subjective satisfaction in our lives by being able to trade our time with one another. I mean, I don't know if I believe in the falling rate of profit as a fundamental principle that is going to imply capitalism must run aground. That's what I'm trying to say.
Well, so I would say a couple of things. I would say our finance industry is basically fantasy. Have you looked at the market capitalization of these firms? It's like the market that's nowhere near what they actually earn. So basically, there's a huge fantasy at the center of the economy, which we're allowed to pursue because we are the empire and could just keep on printing. So there's the issue there. But I would say what tech has mostly done, a couple of things. The big innovations are, of course, social media. And I leave it up to listeners to say whether that was a positive development. I think it's to a large degree increased alienation. Even though it's in some sense good that you and I could talk to each other, of course, that's also true. But I think it's come at the cost of small c conservative communities. The fact that many people live apart from their families, they feel further alienated, they feel further deracinated, that I think is a direct outcome of tech. And it's primarily also caused as getting rid of labor. I mean, what did Uber and Lyft do? What did Seamless Web and
Man, you are a party pooper. You're just raining on everybody's parade.
I just think it's the reality. I mean,
what world would you envision then? I mean, people are not actually
where the technology works for human ends and not the other way around. I mean, this was the dream of Marx, right? Marx is not anti-capitalist, as you well know. He said capitalist was a necessary stage on the road to something better. He called it communist, whatever. People don't like that word. We could call it something else. But to me, the fundamental insight is that you shouldn't have been alienated from the technology. The technology shouldn't control you. You should control the technology. And I don't think we live in that world. I think we live in a world where human life has been subjected to technological imperatives as opposed to technological imperatives subjected to human will. I would argue that that is partially due to the profit motive of capitalism, where the highest end is to make money. And I would argue that a lot of this money is now fake, point to my market capitalization term. I think you also see it that a lot of people have done work when financialization happens historically. That's usually when your society is on decline, whether you look to the Netherlands or the United Kingdom or the United States. But I would say fundamentally we work in service of technology and not the other way around. We're fundamentally alienated in the Marxist sense. It has escaped human will. And to me, nothing good is going to come of that in the medium or long term.
Well, you remind me of my encounter with Marx when I was an undergraduate in a political theory course, reading the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844 and coming into some understanding of what the alienation of labor actually refers to. I can remember some of the discussions from that class more than 50 years ago. Where, I'm trying to think about alienation and about my time is being purchased for the production of a physical commodity that is with surplus, and that's going to enrich the person who owns the means of production, that I have no other way of participating in the economic activity other than by this transaction. And yet my essence is being sucked out of me. I mean, this kind of idea.
Yeah, broadly speaking, also commodity fetishism.
I want to say something, Danny, which is there's something that's chilling in what I understand to be your vision, because I interpret you as saying we have the wrong wants. We're not the people we should be. That the subjects are endogenous. They are partly produced by the system. And what they want now, air conditioning, 4-lane highways, jet planes that are intercontinental, keeping my temperature in the wintertime, an automobile. They want the wrong things. I mean, because there are how many billions of us? 7 billion of us or something like that. And you're saying the planet won't sustain us all having the wrong thing, all wanting the wrong things. But then that puts you in the business of making me want something else.
I think we need to have that conversation, though. I can't say what people want. And obviously, everybody wants air conditioning, and it's reasonable to want air conditioning. The question is, are we able to do that without the incredible negative externalities that are causing climate change, right? I mean, this is actually a social question that needs to be addressed. And we're not even able to pose the question, I think, today, right? You and I are posing the question now. This is not a question that has been ever debated by any of the presidential candidates, even in the mainstream media, is that we're just going down this path of commodification and alienation without even talking about it.
People are not trusting the forecast, I think. They're thinking, okay, there's a trend here, but it's not definitive. And besides, it doesn't reach its resolution for a very long time. And how do I weigh my and my immediate future generations' well-being against these indefinite futures that people are talking about? And they're, I think, implicitly trusting technology. I know you're going to reject this. We're going to fix this. It's right around the corner. Don't worry. We'll have carbon sequestration, or we're going to find,
I'm skeptical, Glenn, to say the very least. Know what I think could happen if you had a sort of Manhattan Project for climate, where the state essentially pools resources and does incredible central planning to have it. But I don't think the market's going to provide the solution for climate change. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. Has there been any indication that that is the case?
No, I mean, there are policy suggestions like carbon taxes and stuff like that, which could help in a program.
Kind of a weak way, is my
But
understanding.
the market doesn't solve the problem that there are external costs associated with the burning of fossil fuels. And I mean, you could try to internalize those costs. You could use the market as a tool, given that you had a commitment to trying to internalize those costs. I think that would be not a bad thing. That would be a good thing. But a solution? No.
Yeah. And so I think there's a lack of imagination, in fact, which is, I think, one of the major reasons that Trump won. I think people just basically said, fuck you to the Democratic Party, that they were essentially providing nothing. The fascist argument, as I don't know, I think I sent you this piece too, was, in my opinion, always bullshit for a variety of historical
I read that with
reasons.
interest there. Actually.
Yeah. So that was always bullshit. It's just not convincing. Also, the Democratic Party appear to have forgotten this, but he was president for 4 years and he didn't govern like a psychopathic fascist. He basically governed like a general Republican with some erratic choices, admittedly, about tariffs and particularly the assassination of Qasem Soleimani of Iran. That was genuinely erratic, and I don't think any Republican would have done that. For the most part, the bureaucracy basically reasserted itself, reaffirmed itself. The party basically reaffirmed itself after a few initial months of kind of crazy appointments like Steve Bannon and Michael Flynn. And so it just didn't hold. So you basically have one party, the Republican Party, essentially being like a fuck you to the system. To me, Trump does not represent an ideology so much as an anti-systemic candidate, and a Democratic Party that I think, and I'm curious what you think about this, I think it's mostly because of professionalization. Like literally the people who staff the party all come from basically the same class and the same series of institutions. And so they have no sense of what's actually going on in the world. Their lives are pretty good, and they were pretty good under Trump as well. So all they can offer is a negative program because they don't actually want to do things like redistribute wealth. They don't actually want to promote equity and equality. So you have the voters essentially rejecting the negative program of the Democratic Party for, again, just an anti-systemic candidate who, in my opinion, at least, doesn't have much to offer. And not only that, and I very much respect John McWhorter, as you know. I know a lot of people on my side don't, but I think John is a real thinker. Like John doesn't get the appeal of Trump, right? And it's because he just doesn't get it. And it's because it's a particular class, there's a particular way of living, it's a particular social space. And I think a lot of the people who staff the Democratic Party come from a similar position. And they're not able to actually offer a genuine program. And when a genuine program was offered by Bernie, Obama knifed him in the back. And I think, Glenn, one thing, I know you hate Obama, me too. I mean, this really destroys his legacy. Like he is now going to go down.
Myself. Yeah, go ahead.
It destroys it. It's just done. Like the sort of fancy Disney adult vision of America that was presented by Barack Obama has been repudiated significantly twice. I would say 3 times, not only by Trump's first victory, but also by the desiccated corpse of Joe Biden becoming president, and then Trump becoming president again. I mean, this is a repudiation of the entire neoliberal, technocratic, institutionalist vision of Obama. And I think that's really the most important story of today, because liberalism is in a crisis because it doesn't have anything to offer. And if the Democratic Party doesn't address that, which it won't because of the process of professionalization, it's going to be fucked into the future. And we're not going to do things that we need to do, like address climate change. I'm very, very black-pilled right now. I'm very, very cynical about the future of this country and this world.
Well, I don't really have anything to add to that.
Well, what would the commenters say? The commenters who are going to be mad. Like, what is the other side of this? Actually, it's fine.
Well, I mean, one line of argument, and I think in our before I started recording conversation, this came up, will be, this is a racist country. It's misogynistic. 2 women have run for president. They've been defeated by a pussy grabber, rapist, felon. And it's a manifestation of the underlying moral, indecency of the American political culture. And they've kind of reverted to form here to a certain extent. And their views about immigration, their views about crime and punishment, their views about transgender rights and so on are, these are deplorables and these are despicables. And, I watched, who was it? Jonathan Capehart during the election returns. I happened to be on PBS looking at the roundtable with David Brooks. And, no offense to Jonathan Capehart, who's a capable guy at what he does. He expresses himself well. He is a Washington Post associate editor and regular on the news hour at PBS. And it was like, as it was becoming clear, as one commentator put it, you don't have to be a weatherman to see which way the wind is blowing. And it was pretty clear what was going on. He was like, I can't believe this country. I can't believe how they would, embrace this guy, this fascist, whatever. I mean, so it'll be that. It'll be a kind of.
But that's nonsense. I mean, this is not empirically true, right? That is just, as our friend Tyler Austin Harper says, that's just sort of like new age self-expiation. That this sort of like teach me about race thing has happened. You would then have to explain the Obama-Trump voters. You would then have to explain the Latino voters. You would then have to explain the actual change in U.S. race relations over the past 70 years, 60 years since the Civil Rights Act, right? It's obviously different. And I do agree that race remains a structuring condition of American society. And I also agree that so does xenophobia. And we should maybe talk about immigration because I think we have very different views on that. So we could argue about that. But it just seems to be like it's so obviously this is a material basis. It's so obviously linked to how Americans feel about their material future and the fact that things have become more expensive. The billionaires have become just way, way more rich. I don't know. Have you seen those statistics since like 2012? They have like exploded in wealth, and that people are just rejecting a Democratic Party that has basically made no moves to do anything about that. Then people would say Lena Khan. I mean, if you look at the problem of monopolization in this country, what the FTC did does not nearly approach what would need to be done to do things like deconglomerate or prevent private equity from coming in and destroying entire industries.
It's never going to happen.
Never going to happen because capitalism. So then we're just going to go sink further and further into, as our friend Karl Marx said, the mutual ruin of the contending classes. I mean, I don't know the last time you read the manifesto, but on the first page, that's what he says. You're either gonna have the dialectical transcendence of the conflict of the age, or you're just going to lead into destruction. And I think all of our ruling elites from the left to the right, and by left I really mean liberals, because the left is just never, as a fact, I wish we could blame the left because that would have mean they would have governed. They just have never governed. So from in this country, so from the liberal quote unquote center to the right, they've just shown no willingness to deal with any of the problems. They instead just try to frame it on a basically ineffable American evil, which is to me an anti-political position. If you're writing off whatever the popular vote that Trump won, what is it going to be 51-ish%? You're just saying 51% of the country is just not reachable. They're evil fascists, blah, blah, blah. That's not politics.
So you can't see skeptical. A working class coalition of any real political weight emerging in the fullness of time. I mean, it would be decades, but, we have to take the long view.
So I would say
what's going on right now, it's populist upsurging. It's a rejection of the elites in some sense. He's getting a lot more minority votes than Republicans have been getting. I mean, that can't be the harbinger of a shift in the sensibility of the working class electorate. So, I mean, why are you so pessimistic?
A couple of reasons. One, historically, I think that other identities have proved more salient to people than class identity, particularly in this country, particularly identity, nationalism, and particularly race, ethnic, and gender identities. And that's a large historical question as to why working class identity has never really been formed in the same way in this country, except for a brief period between, let's say, the 30s and the 60s. I think that has a lot to do with it. Just for most of American history, there was a lot of land. So you're able to sort of like sort of stave off the pressure of class conflict in eastern cities by just going west. And that worked for a really long time. And then eventually the U.S. government made it easy to do things like own a home. So that made it very difficult for class identity to form in this country like it did in other places. So that's what I would say is a major issue that the left has never been able to solve. Also, I would say the left, which has been most conscious of working class identity, I'm writing about this now, was effectively annihilated by the liberal center in the late 1940s and early 1950s. For example, forcing the CIO to get rid of all the left-wing communist unions, which were also the unions that actually organized across race. right? So this was also a project of the American state to basically delegitimize the left using the Cold War as an excuse. So that's one problem. And then the other problem that we have is that the American state is very complex. The American state, if you look at American political development, has just become such a bureaucratized, complex, decentered public-private form that it's actually very, very difficult to affect. It's not like seizing the state in 1920, where there is a limited number of institutions and you could actually control them. The state is now such a matrix of institutions that even were a Bernie to be elected, or if you're feeling bad about Trump, were a Trump to be elected, actually very difficult to transform the American state, which I would argue is fundamentally a liberal state that has liberal prerogatives, has liberal beliefs in empire and capitalism. So you can only really tinker at the edges. Not only that, the type of revolutionary transformation, to add a third, that was possible in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, where you could use violence to do things like seize the state, it's basically just impossible. We have a professionalized military class, and you saw it on January 6th, right? You have a professionalized military class that is going to end all of these things. So I think those are three gigantic obstacles that are probably unovercomable in actual reality.
It's a good thing too, isn't it? It's a good thing too that you can't violently, you can't...
well, I guess it depends on the outcome. Depends how it ends.
Well, what does the history of the 20th century tell us about that, Daniel?
Are we talking about, is this why didn't socialism succeed in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union and China?
Yes, and why didn't violent overthrow of governments on behalf of left-wing ideological utopia lead to a better world for those people? Instead, why did it lead to their subjugation and their impoverishment and imprisonment and whatnot? Weren't those failed experiments?
Two reasons. It very clearly, maybe even three, very clearly got melded with autocracy early on. And in my opinion, you're never going to be able to have a genuine socialist or communist thing if it's not democratic. And in both the Soviet Union and China, pretty clearly not democratic pretty early on. So that was a wrong move. Second, they were peasant agricultural societies, right? If you read Marx, where was the revolution supposed to happen? It was supposed to happen in the advanced industrialized economies of Germany, because that way you could actually use it towards your end. So when you start doing 5-year plans, that's going to inevitably lead to autocracy and make it very, very difficult to actually achieve what you're going to achieve. Second, you had the entire Western Bloc doing everything they can to destroy you from the very beginning. Woodrow Wilson sending troops to the Soviet Union, the United States not recognizing the Soviet Union to 1933, the entirety of the Cold War, where the United States was dedicated to making sure this project didn't succeed. So these were always going to be very, very difficult things for those three structuring conditions. I think the more interesting counterfactual is, what if it actually happened in Germany? What if it actually happened in the United States? These more advanced industrialized economies, could you imagine a counterfactual world where maybe we're not so alienated from technology? Perhaps, but it didn't happen there. And
we're way past that now, and there's no
way
precedent.
Past it. Impossible. Now it's done. We're going to be in the mutual ruin of the contending classes. That's what's actually going to happen. I would bet 90% that we will not solve climate. Things will get worse. Things will get more unequal. And Americans will become more alienated and polarized and hate each other more. That is what I think is going to happen.
I want you to peek into your crystal ball further. This is a very dark vision. Nuclear war. Do you think that's where we're headed? With probability bigger than 0.1.
It's very difficult because the nuclear taboo is powerful, but it hasn't been going for that long. I could see a regime like Putin's feeling backed in and threatened and using quote unquote tactical nukes, which are just lower yield nuclear weapons, and breaking that taboo would, I think, would be very dangerous.
Though it doesn't appear that that's actually happening on the ground in Ukraine.
No, they're winning. I mean, and people who are very fearful of nuclear war, when they talk about their winning, there's a subtle thank God. Because you don't want Putin's back against the wall. And just very quickly, what a failure of the Democratic Party not to force negotiations in 2022. My word. To basically, as Lloyd Austin and Antony Blinken said, that they love the war because it would bog Russia down. They said this in public. This is not me reading any tea leaves. They like the war because it bogged Russia down, is such foreign policy blob nonsense, anti-humanistic nonsense that it's almost...
How do you explain the manufactured consensus? Because it's not just those people that you've named. It is a characteristic of this very same establishment that you've been criticizing on other grounds. that Putin is evil incarnate, that Russia, threatens Europe, and that we must fight to the last Ukrainian to make sure that Putin does it, et cetera. And that became, no one could disagree with that. I mean, no matter what side of the aisle you were standing on. You'd be Tucker Carlson. If you took a position contrary to that, you'd be an outlier and a radical. And how did that happen?
Some heroes like myself did disagree with it in public. But I would say there are three reasons. One, it's a cloistered intellectual community. And as go back to your Kuhn, right? Thomas Kuhn, there are these social things that basically you have to speak within the group in order to be accepted with the group. So that's social group dynamics are operating. Related to that, of course, is what's the famous quote? It's difficult to disagree with something if your salary depends on agreeing with it. So that's also an element there. You're not like, I would never be invited into the Biden administration. If it was my dream to be in the Biden administration or to work for the Rand Corporation or Brookings or the Council on Foreign Relations, then I would have to toe certain lines. So there's that social pressure, which you yourself write about, self-censorship. And also, and I think this is unique to America, I think there's this Protestant millenarianism that goes back, that is like deep in the country, going back to John Winthrop and his 1630 speech about being a city on a hill, right? There's this notion that the American project depends on shedding the light of liberty onto the world at basically the barrel of a gun. And that's the fundamental liberal internationalist position that someone like Blinken or Austin or people who are working for think tanks believe in. So I think that's essentially it. And that the Mersheimers of the world weren't listened to. But also, to be frank, Mersheimer is, I think, he wants to confront China, which I think is also seemingly ridiculous for a variety of reasons. But
well, doesn't he argue that it's inevitable, that this is great power conflict?
What's inevitable is the United States is going to be fucking kicked out of East Asia because there's a gigantic country there that has a 5,000-year-old civilization, and you are living in fantasy land if you think the United States is going to be dominant in East Asia because after World War II, it was able to. It is ridiculous. It is the height of fantasy and absurdity. And if anyone wants to read more, I wrote a cover story for Harper's about that called Empire Burlesque, where I go into the details about how this is an impossible. It's literally fantasy. It's like religious fantasy that the United States is going to be able to do this.
I'm no expert, but I am inclined to agree. Accepting the reality of the fact of China. I mean, Taiwan is just off the coast. It's part of.
Are you kidding me?
China.
It's ridiculous.
The
it's
idea
ridiculous.
that we would intercede in an effort to prevent the historical inevitability of a resolution in some manner or fashion, but it ain't our business, is it really? I mean,
Glenn, the average person, if an alien picked the average person, they would be Han Chinese. I mean, like this is not a battle that the United States is going to win in even the medium term. So again, this is sclerotic institutions that no one believes in. I don't think this was a major reason why Trump won, but people don't want wars. Americans don't want wars. The Cold War consensus no longer exists. The United States doesn't want to be sending arms to Ukraine or Israel. I mean, this is just a fact of the matter.
But now, Mearsheimer, to his credit, has been arguing that the Ukraine fiasco is a mistake of historic proportions that the West has made on insisting on NATO expansion, and that the effort to humiliate Russia and Putin is a fool's errand and it's cutting your nose to spite your face, and you're not going to win in any case. So.
And he's totally right. In my opinion, and the same could be said for China. I mean, the sad thing is you could quote unquote win in Israel, but it's going to be ethnic cleansing. If that's a win, then I'm not sure that's a real win, to be honest.
I mean, you're not sure what's a real win?
Ethnic cleansing. Like Israel going to dominating Gaza and probably under Trump the West Bank as well. To me, that's not something that Americans should be proud of providing military weaponry for, personally. In my humble opinion, as a Jewish American who's well aware of what happened during the Holocaust.
Well, what about the survival of the state of Israel? Isn't the Zionist project threatened? It's surrounded by enemies and on all sides, and doesn't the United States?
Glenn, I hear it in your voice. You don't believe this. Israel's a nuclear armed power. That's really the long and short of it. Israel's a nuclear armed power, and not only that. That's really number one, and the United States
in other words, they can take care of themselves, or
they could take care. The Jewish people are not under threat in Israel. It is not an existential struggle like it might have been in the first decades of the state's existence. I will admit that it is not unreasonable in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. I mean, I don't agree with this for because I really know the issue. But if you're like an American observing it post-Holocaust, you could worry about the existential survival of the Jewish people, right? After 73, this is no longer a worry at all. Not only are they nuclear armed, but they essentially have the total backing of the world's hegemonic superpower. And not only that, I think it's pretty clear that the Arab states are very interested in normalization. I think that's very clear with Saudi, Jordan, Egypt, et cetera, et cetera. So the types of things you saw in the first 30 years of Israel's existence. And I think, and this is not a wild thing, a lot of the experience that shaped baby boomers' understanding of the conflict are just no longer true. It is no longer the empirical reality. The Jews have, quote unquote, won in the region. They are not on the verge of being pushed into the sea. So I think that has to be the starting place of your analysis. If you're just going to say that there's an existential threat for Israel, I do not think you are living in reality. I do not think that is an accurate representation of what is going on the ground. It is an atavistic understanding that hasn't been true for literal decades.
Well, now we were talking about Mearsheimer, and his take here is not very sympathetic to the Zionist project. He thinks it's an ethnic cleansing, inevitability, and a genocidal prosecution of war in Gaza. But he also thinks that the long-term prospects for Israel are grim in terms of the strategic situation, notwithstanding the possession of nuclear weapons. He thinks that they're surrounded. Hezbollah is driving people out of the north. They've got a gazillion missiles. Iran, he says, go up the escalation ladder with Israel and Iran. Israel doesn't contemplate winning that one necessarily because they're vulnerable. And he says part of the survival threat is not external. Part of it is internal, about the fissures within the society and about the extent to which people are going to move from Tel Aviv to New York if missiles start falling on Tel Aviv. So what do you say to that?
I mean, first, what's the problem with the last one? Unless you believe, like, ontologically, it's almost a philosophical position that the Jews need an ethno-state. And that's a position that someone could hold. But now we're in the realm of subjectivity, like what is good, what is bad. In terms of the sort of empirical realm, I am more skeptical than Mearsheimer that there is going to be a great power conflict that results in the annihilation of the state of Israel. I just don't think that seems likely in any reasonable time frame. So then we're talking 50. He's basically making a philosophical point, like his offensive realism. I mean, he has a theory of history. Mearsheimer has a theory of history that is embedded in offensive realism, which I think is wrong because it misreads human nature. Mearsheimer thinks that human nature as basically humans have an inevitable will to dominate, or at least he would frame it. He would not frame it like that. He would frame it that they have an inevitable will to security and that this necessitates constantly expanding. I think that basically reifies the United States' experience of global domination after World War II as being fundamental to human nature. If from another perspective, and I wrote an essay about this for, I think it was Boston Review, but like you could argue that from another perspective, you could see actually the trend of human nature is to have larger and larger sets of communities from the village to the state to the nation. Why can't that encompass the globe, right? That's an equally valid theory of history. So I think that's a philosophical point that Mearsheimer is ultimately making, basically, again, a theory of history, which I don't think has empirically been the case. Like, there's no empirical basis for it. It's a leap of faith in a literal religious sense, because that's what realists have to do to make their arguments. They have to make a leap of faith about human nature, which is not empirically verifiable. And will not be empirically verifiable, as we've seen the replication crisis in social psychology demonstrate, that you're not going to be able to really get at the problem of human nature from an empirical social scientific basis. So you're essentially arguing philosophy, which is important and good, but is not that useful for thinking about international relations or policy, in my opinion.
Yeah, man, as a trained economist, that was not good to hear. I didn't really want to hear that.
So I have a question for you, actually.
Yeah.
So what do you think about the fact that the macroeconomy... So I'm going to give you my take, and you could tell me why I'm an idiot. I think the macroeconomic measures are useful for certain things. It'd be ridiculous to deny that they are not. They are not that connected to the lived economic experience of most people in the country. And it's funny, and I'm curious what you think about this, because you look at Hayek. As far as I know, Hayek very rarely, if at all, talks about something like GDP, right? Because he does not think that you are able to actually abstract social relations to that level.
Yeah.
Right? He primarily approaches economics as a philosophy. So to me, it's ironic. I'm arguing a small c conservative position about social science, an anti-progressive position that you actually can't do types of social engineering that a macroeconomic indicator like GDP would in theory let you do. Just curious what you think about that, given the results of the election. as an economist?
Well, I think the interesting point in what I heard you say was the lived experience aggregated through political mechanisms could be inconsistent or opposite to the aggregative measures that the statistical measurements of economic activity might indicate. So, Paul Krugman has been saying for a while the economy is really much better than people think it is. But that could have been the fact that his measure of the economy and people's basis for their thinking didn't intersect very much at all. I agree that Hayek is very skeptical about the aggregative projects and about the measures of, quote, welfare that would be used to guide the judgments that a centralized authority might make, and how those are very far from the actual well-being as it's being experienced by individuals who are very different in their circumstances and very different in their preferences and orientations. So he wants to allow them the liberty to make these decisions at the micro level, and he doesn't think you can necessarily aggregate up and preserve the information that's idiosyncratic information characteristic of each person's situation. So, I think that. I think there's a lot of gaslighting that goes on in the politics of macroeconomic stuff. And I think some of the aggregative measures, like how is the budget of the United States out of balance and its bills are not being paid and debts have to be incurred that impose liabilities on future generations. And we make promises through our social insurance programs, which the revenue generating mechanisms for which are insufficient to cover those promises going forward. And all of that, those are very interesting things to talk about. And you would use aggregative indications of one sort or another to try to get your hand around them, your mind around them. So, I'm not agnostic about the possibility of useful policy information coming out of macroeconomic measures, although I do think that the politicians, he created so many jobs. I think that's just, rhetoric. It's just
also
nonsense.
just not true. I mean, like, I think if you actually look into it, it's not like really that true. What do you think about this failure of polling? Because I study this as a historian, like social science has been taking a beating the last 15 or so years as an intellectual project. It's about 100 years old. The American Economics Association, I think, is either 1895 or 1905, whatever, around the fin de siècle. It's not that old a project. And I think that it's really been taking a beating. I'm just curious what you think about that as a social scientist. And especially a social scientist who was educated at its absolute height of people placing faith in it.
I just did a conversation with Rajiv Sethi, the economist at Columbia Barnard College, on prediction markets, in which he was observing that where people make their bets about who's going to win the election and the price of the securities paying $1 in the event that Trump or Harris prevail, give you some indication of the probability that the traders have in mind that Trump or Harris will prevail, and how those were out of line with the predictions of polling often, and what was going on there. I mean, polling is a pretty crude business, isn't it? I mean, it's not as if you've got controlled experiments. I mean, I think this actually should be noted. There is the crude application of bad data and trying to make sweeping conclusions. So I have a survey of the population. I'm going to tell you what people want or what their values are. And on the one hand, and you might be very skeptical about that. I can remember once serving on a study group for the National Academy of Sciences where the question was how to measure discrimination. And there was a statistician from Carnegie Mellon, I don't remember his name now, who was insistent that the only real way to measure discrimination is to have a controlled experiment where, you send the same person and that person is white on one instance, and then you send that person again and he's black on another instance, and you see whether they're treated differently. Anything else where you use like census data or whatever to try to tease out the controlling for the was crude and unreliable as a scientific judgment. And controlled experimentation might be helpful in trying to tease out, distinguish between certain hypotheses. But I think polling, who's the sample? What are the questions that are being asked? What are the methods of soliciting people's responses and whatever? I think it's crude.
Why do you think the media then focuses so much on it? Because to me, this is again part of the crisis of liberalism thesis that I'm exploring, which is that they have to focus on it because because they can't get into actually the deeper qualitative realities of how people live. Because exploring those deeper qualitative realities would necessarily engender an entire rethinking of the paradigm that they have embraced. So polling has become the obsession of the elite media sphere. And I'm
Instead
curious
of
what you think of
political
that.
reporting that was more person on person and kind of ethnographic, or in
Yeah,
textured and involving narrative
anthropological.
Anthropological, yeah.
I think that arrives at more useful truths than polling, it seems like, again and again and again. But the elite media seems allergic to it. Then the interesting question is, why do you think they're allergic to it? Except when this is so good, man. Except when it became to J.D. Vance, and they loved Hillbilly Elegy, and then he became sort of the hand person of the person that they hated the most. That is delicious. That they made a movie about him, and then he became like their arch nemesis. That is just modern liberalism, kicking yourself in the face over and over again by elevating this guy, letting him become senator of Ohio, then him becoming vice president for Trump. Mwah! Chef's kiss. Great job, liberals.
What do you make
job.
of the fact that Sherrod Brown and Bob Casey went down?
I think it's just the economic thing. I literally think that this is like crude. Someone once told me vulgar Marxism explains a lot. And I think in this instance, vulgar Marxism really does explain a lot. I think this particular election is just a material. Things have gotten more expensive. People can't own houses. People are working 2 or 3 jobs for shit money. That's why they lost. I don't think it's really more complicated than that. Maybe, I might be wrong, though. What do you think?
Now, what about identity politics? What about the transgender stuff? What about...
I don't think it's a winning issue, Glenn. I don't think
it's a winning issue.
No, I don't think it's a winning issue. Because it hasn't won. My guess is that there's probably a few hardcore people on both sides, people who really hate this idea of transgender and people who really think it's a civil rights struggle of our time. My guess, at least when we're just not to bracket like the discussion of transgender, just to put it in the issue, because obviously I think they should all have civil rights and et cetera. But I do think that it was not viewed by many people as the most important political issue of the time. And that focusing too much on that made it seem to a lot of people that the Democratic Party didn't really care about the material realities of their lives. That is my guess. More data. I mean, the research should be done. We don't know. Given the fact that she was creamed in all of the swing states, and basically she lost the entire Rust Belt, I think people probably mostly view it as a distraction, would be my guess.
Yeah. So as we close here, I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the Reconstruction project that the Democratic Party faces, or whether you would even deign to think about that since you have such disdain for the party as a whole.
I just want to say, I think my disdain is empirically based, right? I just want to emphasize it's not coming out of nowhere. The party has proven itself again and again and again incapable of reformation. Not only that, the party basically strangled the left populist baby in the crib. So it has not demonstrated that it is actually interested in doing what might need to be done in terms of party reformation in order to win elections. And I don't think it's not the 1850s. There's not an emergent Republican Party coming to replace the Whigs. I don't see that happening either. So I don't think they're going to do much, would be my guess. I don't think they're going to deprofessionalize themselves. I think they're the party of the professional managerial elite, and they will remain the party of the professional managerial elite, even as that circle of people who care about that shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. That's not very good for the country. But Glenn, before we go, I do want to ask you something. What's your take on immigration? Because I think we have different views. So basically, I view immigration as the harvest of empire. If you're going to be the global hegemon, and you're going to have bases around the world, and you're going to have dollar hegemony, and you're going to destroy the economies of other countries, you're going to get immigrants. So to me, that's the fundamental ethical question. And therefore, you have to accept those immigrants because you have destroyed their lives. Even if it does, show that it
I would
prices.
question the causality. I understand that there are legitimate questions about American imperial footprint.
Vis-a-vis Mexico, Glenn, come on. We have been dominating that economy
Venezuela,
for centuries.
China. I mean, a lot of those people crossing the border without authorization are not from Mexico. I mean, they're from all over.
Where's the majority from?
And I think probably more than that, they're coming from Central America, Latin America.
So Mexico and Central America.
Mexico. They have to go through Mexico from Nicaragua or El Salvador.
I mean, Nicaragua, how many times has the United States invaded and occupied Nicaragua in the 20th century?
And therefore, the United States is responsible to take the overflow of people who want to escape the consequences of that, because there was no agency on the part of these countries. The United States is the master of the board here.
The United States is a structuring condition. It's the sun of the solar system of international relations. And so obviously these planets have their own trajectories. But yes, the United States absolutely has an ethical responsibility if it's going to decide to dominate the world.
I don't know where that comes from. An ethical responsibility? I think
if you're going to, we could have
perhaps they should, but we have our own interests. And my view is, you have a country, you have a border, you have the integrity of deciding who comes into your country or not. You lose control of that.
So that's a more important issue than because these are. It's just. I mean, that's obviously like nation states have borders, and this is something that nation states do. But to me, it really is like how you're going to place the ethical consideration, right? What is the cost of the empire? If you're going to decide to economically dominate Central America and North America for centuries, how does that not come across with an ethical responsibility to the people that you are dominating and controlling, who then want to come to the hegemon?
My ethical responsibility is to my citizens, not to people in other lands who speculatively, on your theoretical argument, are forced into a migratory stance by my actions.
So then the ethical responsibility of the nation supersedes the ethical responsibility to the human.
The grounding
it's a position
of any ethical responsibility is ultimately based in the historical development. I mean, I am obviously, is it not obviously more responsible to see that a social safety net that upholds the living standards of my fellow citizens is in place than I am to ensure that a comparable safety net extends to the totality of humanity. And besides, it's not a decision that's made in a room. It's a decision that has to be the culmination of a political process endorsed by the people who will bear the costs of it. And to tell them that they should think in global terms and not in terms of their families, their neighbors, and their compatriots is easy to say and tyrannical to impose on them against their will.
I have a question then. There are other ways then to make wages higher than reducing immigration, arguably more effective ways like raising the minimum wage or taxing the extraordinarily wealthy. Why not do those as opposed to cutting off That's what I never understood, because it's not like there are not ways to make society more equal and more equitable. But why focus on the immigrant, which to me seems like actually like not the most effective ways to do things like raise.
This is not unique to the United States and its position as an imperial master. I mean, we see concerns about immigration all over. What's going on in the United Kingdom? What's going on in Germany? What's going on in Netherlands? What's going on in France?
Well, exactly. All the countries you picked are the countries of the Western hegemony that has dominated the world through the last 500 years of colonialism. And again, the harvest of empire.
Well,
That's what I would say to that.
The wealth of these countries, the prosperity of these countries is not an appropriation from the rest of the world, entitling the rest of the world to free entry into them. It's a little bit more complicated than that, isn't it, Danny?
It's sure more complicated, but there's also truth to Wallerstein. I mean, world systems theory is not ipso facto incorrect. There's a lot of reality, to me at least, empirically and historically.
I want to know where your should comes from. I mean, even if I grant you, and I'm not granting you, the causal analysis world system, we're responsible for this or that. Where does this should come from? What's the position on high from which you render an ethical judgment about that?
Well, I think that's true of any ethical judgment that anyone ever renders. It's ultimately a should. I mean, now we're just talking philosophy, but I'm a humanist.
It's not just philosophy. It is philosophy, but it's not just philosophy.
Well, in terms of the ethical ranking, right? Like you could make various arguments, but I mean,
what's
many
your
Jews
touchstone?
throughout
Is it
history?
a John Rawls kind of thing, a theory of justice kind of thing? I mean, what's the
I don't even think you need
for
Rawls.
the should?
Ethical humanism. I mean, Jewish cosmopolitanism. I mean, this is a classic thing that Jews developed over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries as they were excluded from European societies. I think ultimately that's where my ethical position is grounded in the experience of diasporic Jewry and not being part of the political community for many, many years, even though now we definitely are part of the political community. But that's where the grounding comes from. It doesn't really come from the liberal political philosophy of, the veil of ignorance of John Rawls. It comes from the historical experience of the Jewish diasporic people, of being people on the outside and being people who are oppressed. That's where it comes from. Ethical humanism.
Why do I not see more? Why do I not see more expression of that Jewish sensibility in the policies of the state of Israel?
I think because that is a great question, and I would say there is a significant divergence between diasporic Jewry and the ethno-national Judaism that has arisen in the state of Israel. One thing that I say is like diasporic cosmopolitanism is the best thing the Jews came to the world. I mean, I think this is an inevitable outcome of being an ethno-state. And there are historical reasons for why Jews believed in the wake of the Holocaust that they needed to construct an ethno-state, and I don't think that it is easy to dismiss those reasons in 2024 when Israel is very powerful. It's not so wild in the late 1940s or early 1950s to understand why the Jewish people of Europe felt that they needed to have their own ethno-state. But I think it's essentially that. It's a feeling of the exact type of thing, but channeled in another direction. I think this is quite interesting because precisely what you're saying is correct. I think the experience of Jews in Europe led to very different outcomes. You have like the cosmopolitanism, the humanism of a Karl Popper. You have the embrace of capitalism of a George Soros, because in capitalism, you're able to, in some sense, shed your identity because it just matters how much money you make. And then you have the embrace of ethno-nationalism by people who founded the state of Israel, David Ben-Gurion or Theodor Herzl. And you have other reactions as well. And I think that cauldron of experience of Jewish oppression has led to a lot of the major philosophies of the 20th century to emerge. And people have different choices.
Not just Jewish philosophies, major. Have you ever read this book by a guy called Cudahy called The Ordeal of Civility?
No, I haven't read it, no.
The Ordeal
I think I might have heard you talk about it.
Cudahy is the last name. I don't remember the first name. But in any case, it's a study of Marx, Freud, and Levi-Strauss. An economist, a psychologist, and an anthropologist. And The Ordeal of Civility is a story of the modernization of the Jewish experience in Europe and how the various conflicts that emerged for that process of modernization filtered through the thinking of these great founding theorists of their respective disciplines in discernible ways. That's the argument of Cudahy in that book. But I'm reminded of it by what you say.
I did hear about it, and I heard about it from you. And he's conservative, right? This is like early 70s. Yeah, there's like a little bit 70s. There's a racial tinge, if I recall, when I looked into this. Like that would make us a bit uncomfortable. But I mean, you get an argument similarly from Yuri Slezsky, and much more recently, The Jewish Century, right? Which is talking about how this experience of Europe essentially led to these modern philosophies. But just to bring it back to the conversation, that's where my philosophy comes from.
John Murray Cudahy.
Yeah.
a very Irish Catholic name.
Yeah.
All right. Dan, we didn't come to agreement about the big questions, but it was certainly a lot of fun. And don't take too much pleasure in the defeat of the Democrats.
Well, do you think it's going to be like a world historic? To me, I'm doubtful. I may be proven wrong, but I don't think Trump's going to control the state.
I think I agree wholeheartedly. I said as much when John McWhorter and I were talking about this, about Obama having been put in the dustbin of history kind of by what's unfolded. I think the idea that it would be the Republican Party, the party of the plutocrats and the billionaires, to whom the working class would turn for succor in a time of economic trouble. I mean, I think that's mind-boggling. What an own goal of the Democrats to allow that. Donald Trump, the tribune of the non-college educated man? I mean, that's...
First is tragedy.
Then it's farce.
I mean, that's the reality. We're living in the mutual ruin of the contending classes. It sucks. It sucks for me because I can't even buy a house.
I'm sorry, Danny.
That's a real trauma.
Hang in there.
Thanks, Glenn.
Okay, take care. Thanks again for everything. This is Daniel. This is Glenn Loury. I'm saying goodbye to Daniel Bessner, who's professor of international studies at the University of Washington's Scoop Jackson School of International Studies. And I'm Glenn Loury. So thanks, Danny.
Bye, Glenn.